All right, so hi everyone, good afternoon, and thank you so much for taking the time to attend my lecture today titled A Matter of Perspective, Craft Reflexivity, and CNF in the SHS Curriculum. Here's the outline for my discussion. I'll begin by providing a brief overview of CNF in the K-12 curriculum and then move on to a review and critique of the Department of Education's Curriculum Guide for CNF as a primary resource used by many of those who teach the subject to SHS students. Finally, I will discuss the case for integrating perspective as a key concept in teaching how to read and write CNF at the secondary level. My analysis examines the core curricular documents provided by the DepEd for the teaching of creative writing in general and CNF in particular to Filipino SHS students, guided by my own practice and interest in CNF writing and pedagogy, with a focus on critiquing the features of the CNF curriculum guide which signify the conceptual underpinnings of its proposed creative practices. While this discussion does not go into the material aspects of the history and formulation of the K-12 materials for CNF, it foregrounds the ideological context embedded in these materials and examines how they can be reviewed and reformulated for the purpose of elevating CNF pedagogy at the SHS level. I argue that there are major gaps in the CNF curriculum guide as presently constructed, and that there is a need to articulate a craft-based approach to CNF pedagogy that recognizes not only the aesthetic, but the critical and political significance of the genre. So the K-12 program was first implemented in the Philippines in 2012, and it is comprised of 6 years of basic education and 6 years of secondary education, with the latter divided into 4 years of junior high school and 2 years of SHS or senior high school. Creative Nonfiction is currently designed as an 80-hour course taught to SHS students taking the humanities and social sciences strand under K-12. So as you can see here, the CNF course ideally comes at the end of a ladderized series of related classes. The first level is the SHS course subject 21st century literature in the Philippines and in the world, followed by the academic track subject of creative writing, which is then also a prerequisite for creative nonfiction. Several factors are salient in the argument for the review of the DepEd CNF curriculum guide. First, there is a need to tackle the thorny issue of definition for pedagogical functionality. Creative nonfiction, as seen alongside the other venerable genres taught in high schools throughout the Philippines, is a relatively young field with fewer educational resources available to secondary level instructors. Cristina Pantoja Hidalgo, whose textbooks on CNF have become a major reference in both high schools and universities in our country, explains that the term creative nonfiction was coined only in the 1970s, even as the essay in the Philippines was already being published before World War II, as seen in the newspapers, magazines, and essay collections of the pre-war period. Though the essay category was not included among the initial categories of the Palanca Awards when it was first established in 1950, the essay and sanaysay were added in 1979. Over past few decades, CNF has solidified as a distinct field in our schools, libraries, bookstores, and publishing houses, and today works in this genre are written in an enormously diverse range of styles, about an enormously diverse range of topics, exemplifying how, as Hidalgo puts it, contemporary CNF has become extremely varied and tremendously exciting. Given the emphasis on diversity of form and style in characterizing CNF, definitiveness emerges as an important pedagogical tool. As a faculty member of our own creative writing program here in UP, I am familiar with how literature and creative writing students are encouraged to dissect the concept of CNF in our own courses, taught to interrogate the history of the concept and what it has come to signify, both positive and negative, in terms of craft and criticism for Filipino readers and writers. However, at the secondary level, there is an urgent need to reframe definitive clarity as a pedagogical concept. The notion of clarity is often used for hegemonic purposes, and the term should not be used in a reductive way intended to limit the genre to a prescriptive definition and a fixed set of elements. Rather, the push for a clear definition of CNF would refer more properly to setting boundaries in a way that can be tailored to achieve desired outcomes. This entails a deconstruction of CNF to highlight its most essential characteristics in a generative manner, instead of limiting it to a predetermined list of subgenres. Second, there is immense value in enhancing CNF pedagogy at the secondary level as a precursor to the further study and practice of literary writing. The current general approach to creative writing pedagogy at all levels in the Philippines is ladderized and hierarchical in alignment with the dominant spiral progression structure of education in the country, defined by corpus as a strategy whereby concepts are first introduced at a young age and then reinforced in progressively more sophisticated ways over the years. As noted in the previous slide, CNF is at the end of a strand of courses under K-12, ideally fully comprehended after understanding and utilizing key ideas about 21st century literature and creative writing in previous classes, and after engaging with nonfiction at the primary level as a source of objective information. It can only be beneficial then to ensure that high school instruction in CNF equips students with the capacity to appreciate and adapt to the still evolving nature of the genre in the Philippines. The institutionalization of the term in various institutions such as the DepEd, the Center for Higher Education, and the Cultural Center of the Philippines suggests that the label is here to stay, though within the academe there are explorations of the possibility of taking our own direction, diverging from the rise of CNF as category in the United States, perhaps by recentering the term essay as more the potential for critical thinking, contextualization, and reflexivity promised by the genre. Rather than having to unlearn ideas from high school, CNF practitioners within and outside college should find that further encounters with the essay, in all its multitude of forms and perspectives, are enriched rather than muddled by recalling the secondary level framing of CNF. Finally, given the emergence in the academe of creative writing studies as a field in its own right, it is imperative to reevaluate and reframe how creative writing and various literary genres are taught in our country. CWS, with its emphasis on context, history, and analysis, with proponents that advocate for resistance to institutional hegemonic forces and for theorizing of the effects of creative writing's academic institutionalization on the imaginative texts produced, provides the opportunity to reflect upon CNF through a craft-based approach. CW education at the SHS level in the Philippines has been predominantly shaped by the contextualized adherence to formalism, whereby the act of writing creatively is treated as the construction of a self-contained text modeled on canonical Western forms, using as building blocks the tools and elements of different genres. The most common tools of CW pedagogy are the workshop and the choice of elements and techniques for transmission as a framework for content. Creative writing studies situates these not as objective, neutral concepts, but as practices rooted in the history of colonization and oppression throughout the world. SHS students are not unequipped to grasp these complex ideas. In fact, among the goals of SHS education is to ensure that learners are equipped with competencies required for specialization studies in the future, and that SHS subjects are geared towards the acquisition of common but critical competencies. And given recent developments in the country, the need to strengthen the capacity of the K-12 program to transmit such skills is more urgent than ever. In this milieu, creative writing must be distanced from the misconception that it is a site for pure expression and impartial artistry, and understood by both learners and instructors as spaces for the exploration of criticality and resistance. I have utilized craft and reflexivity as lenses for critiquing the DepEd's curriculum guide and proposing alternative ways forward. Craft is framed here as a set of expectations which are not universal, but rather standardized, as Larissa puts it, underscoring the need not just to learn the techniques and devices taught to creative writers, but to explore and question their origins towards a greater purposiveness in applying and adapting such practices. As Alice's further writes, we must be careful not to frame craft as prescription or even guidelines without first making it clear where those guidelines come from and whom they benefit. Reflexivity is therefore embedded in this conceptualization of craft as it demands the recognition of bias, positionality, and impact. Bordeaux, theorizing reflexivity, argued for a need to question the privilege of the knowing subject and urged researchers to convert reflexivity into a disposition capable of acting not ex post on the opus operatum, but a priori on the modus operandi. For essayists, there's immense value in the application of reflexivity to the process of writing and the second-order questioning and challenging of one's own thoughts and beliefs. There is a need to reflect upon how and why you write and how you are being read, which is central to CNF as a genre from which readers uniquely demand a commitment to factuality. I argue that for writers, there is value in framing this as a commitment to the labor of research, or more broadly, to the labor of knowing, in order to underscore the centrality of the writer in refracting different kinds of information about the subject of their works. Claiming factuality without reflexivity only lends weight to criticisms of CNF as a narcissistic genre and predisposes readers and writers to give greater weight to the content of a text than it may deserve. So at this point, I will move on to the specifics of my review and critique of the DepEd Curriculum Guide for CNF. The DepEd is one prong in the trifocal education system of the country, which includes CHED and the Technical Education and Skills Development Authority, or TESDA. DepEd is mandated to formulate, implement, and coordinate all major policies and programs in the area of basic and secondary education. CHED is also mandated under RA 10533 to contribute to K-12 reform through 4 key areas, including curriculum consultation and teacher training and education, working with DepEd to craft harmonized basic and tertiary curricula. This codifies that those in tertiary education have a role to play in the development of the K-12 curriculum. For CNF, moreover, as the field is rooted in and has predominantly been theorized in universities and cultural institutions, there is a need for tertiary-level educators to cascade the content of CNF pedagogy as the genre finds its way into secondary curricula, helping to provide a framework for the instructors who are teaching CNF to SHS students. Though tertiary education is generally more focused on specialized and in-depth study in a particular field of discipline, university-level approaches to CNF content can be translated to accommodate the ends of secondary education, which provides a broad foundation of knowledge across various subjects and aims to equip students with essential skills towards higher education or employment. This slide shows the course descriptions provided by DepEd for its courses in 21st century literature, creative writing, and creative nonfiction. The DepEd is mandated to provide education that is not only accessible and inclusive, but also liberating, that is, geared towards the formation of citizens who will contribute to national development. Certainly, the language of these materials demonstrates some degree of adherence to these principles, though it is markedly less pronounced in the creative writing and CNF courses. The 21st century literature course underscores appreciation and critical study of texts from the Philippines, while the CW and CNF courses are more practical, focused on transmissions of types and techniques. There are other points worth noting in the way that CNF is described. Foremost are the obvious problems with the course description, given the imprecision in the listing of autobiography and blogging as equal modes of the genre and the nesting of these terms under formal elements and writing techniques. The description also ends with the phrase imaginative readers and writers, using imaginative in the general sense of artistry and aesthetics, when in the pedagogical discourse of creative writing, especially CNF, the concept of imaginative is more commonly utilized in contrast with factual or real. And yet, CNF is the only genre that gets its own self-contained class. It is differentiated from the other genres in the prerequisite creative writing course, which tackles fiction, drama, and poetry over its 80-hour curriculum. Instead, CNF is taught as its own category, both part and apart from the way that creative writing is delineated in the humanities and social sciences strand. The DepEd Curriculum Guide for CNF begins by reviewing literary genres for the purpose of helping learners distinguish between different genres and their associated conventions. Fiction, poetry, and drama are spelled out as traditional genres. There is a clear emphasis on reviewing the elements of techniques for each of these. Having ensured that such concepts are fresh in the minds of SHS students, the curriculum guide then zeroes in on CNF. It breaks the genre down into its principles, elements, techniques, and devices. In fact, it lists no fewer than a dozen items in its section on the elements of creative nonfiction. As seen here, many of these elements are culled from the elements attributed to other literary genres in the previous creative writing curriculum guide. So figures of speech comes from poetry, dialogue from drama, and the bulk of material of the elements, characters, characterization, point of view, plot, etc., are copied from the fiction module. This is a clear application of the common description of CNF as a form of literature that applies the techniques of other literary genres to the writing of nonfiction. However, the sheer range of elements attributed to CNF seems to suggest not necessarily an appreciation for the versatility of the genre, but perhaps an uncertainty regarding its scope, solved by simply putting in almost everything arising from previous discussions of the other literary genres. Moreover, um, despite the inclusion of point of view and angle in the DepEd's elements of CNF, one of the most glaring omissions in the curriculum guide as presently constructed is the recognition of the first-person perspective as a key characteristic of CNF. There is no mention of the self, the I, the persona, or any variations thereof. While the DepEd curriculum guide does give instructors the freedom to interpret point of view and angle as expressions of the embeddedness of the self in CNF, it is more likely for these terms to be interpreted in other ways. Point of view, for example, given the previously listed elements of fiction, will probably be discussed as the choice of the writer between first, second, and third or person point of view. And angle, given the mention of journalism and reportage as forms of CNF, may be discussed as the focus or the point of the article, as in how to construct a headline or a lead. Consider this example of a learner's manual for CNF used by the Calabarzon DepEd office. As you can see, angle and point of view are combined and explained in a manner that relies on a fiction-based rather than a CNF-based understanding of these elements. The next section then differentiates various forms and types of CNF, which explicitly lists down the following: autobiography/biography, literary journalism/reportage, personal narratives, travelogue, reflection essay, true narratives, blogs, testimonial, and other types and forms. The guide then concludes with exercises on reading, writing, and critiquing CNF. But one might ask, upon examining this document, what exactly is a true narrative and how is it different from a personal narrative? Wouldn't a blog, as a platform-based category chiefly characterized by the unique voice and concerns of the blogger, have significant overlaps with many of the other listed forms of CNF? And why include so specific a subgenre as testimonial, inextricably intertwined with its Latin American roots, when perhaps other parallel categorizations more relevant to the Philippines are not included? An example would be what Hidalgo discusses in her textbook, a trend of a type of writing by women, which she labels as confessional writing, for example. So this taxonomic unevenness exposes the limitations of working only with borrowed concepts rather than coming up with a set of localized and organic characteristics and forms rooted in the actual practice and potential of CNF in the Philippines. CW practitioners have taken other approaches to anthologizing and publishing forms of CNF in the country. For instance, the types of CNF listed by Hidalgo in her popular CNF anthology, Creative Nonfiction, a Reader, have the virtue of being based on a selection of works entirely by Filipino authors. Hidalgo also acknowledges her focus on works published in newspapers and magazines, stating that she wished to draw attention to the high quality of the writing in a field which convention tends to regard as inferior to literature, namely journalism. So this can be seen in the categories in her CNF Reader: reportage, feature articles, interview stories, travel essays, and personal recollections. Another example is the mode of categorization utilized by Evasco, Lara, David, and La Rosa in their own SHS textbook for CNF, Creative Nonfiction, Crafting a Knowledge of Self, Others, and the World, which focuses on thematic selection as a means of understanding the broader insights behind personal narratives and serve as prompts for writing by students as well. So in her introduction to her anthology, Hidalgo writes that it is part of the nature of creative nonfiction that its applications are difficult to label. Hence, the pieces included here should logically not be classified under distinct headings. However, in deference to the teacher who may wish to be able to determine what sort of writing lies between the covers, I have tried to classify them. But she warns, take these classifications with a grain of salt. In her own introduction to their textbook, titled The Language of Heart Memory, Evasco writes that these selections were divided into overarching life themes or patterns in human maturations. She highlights that these patterns or motifs could exceed its boundaries, overlap, and blend with each other, since life as we know it is not easily divided into neat little categories. Nonetheless, The thematic groupings are meant to highlight the larger insights of each piece. Another way forward is suggested by Cruz. At the tertiary level, CNF pedagogy incorporates the use of a curated reading list, which are not necessarily subdivided into kinds or types, but selected for exemplifying key characteristics of the genre. Cruz's monograph entitled Partial Views on the Essay as a Genre in Philippine Literary Production includes a bilingual list of essays which are not further subdivided or subcategorized. However, the list is distinguished from other essay anthologies by its strenuous underscoring of the partial and provisional nature of her selections. Cruz describes how she teaches her compilation regularly revised to university students. She writes, I try to instill a keen awareness of the limits of the required reading list to register its incompleteness, even as we strive to attend to it with care and rigor. Transparency in this regard is one of the ways I hope to keep the course, particularly the reading they do, open and open-ended so that it serves not simply as an assigned regimen for them to complete but and limits of the semester. Notably, the DepEd's listing of forms and types of CNF does not encourage the emphasis on transparency and elasticity described in any of the presented pedagogical strategies. Such variation in the labeling and organization of the various kinds of writing which fall within the loose boundaries of CNF may stem from unresolved contradictions with the label of the genre as a whole. In practice, in the Philippines, the terms CNF and essay have been used seemingly interchangeably to denote the same cluster of texts. A Palanca Award-winning text for the essay category, for instance, is ripe for usage in any academic course titled Creative Nonfiction. And it is common to compile columns or features published in newspapers as a collection of essays. However, discourse regarding CNF's essay persists in the academe. In their introduction to the Critica Cultura special section on the contemporary Philippine essay in English, co-editors Guillermo and Villanueva strongly critiqued the usage of CNF. They stated that they sought in their selection of essays for publication in the issue to contribute to problematizing the assumptions behind the kind of writing being cast as literary under the popular banner Creative Nonfiction. Among these assumptions, the interchangeability of terms, that there is a kind of nonfiction writing that is novel enough to be its own literary genre simply because it employs that a literary form can be reduced to techniques, that the reason for using these techniques can be to simply make things more dramatic and compelling, that the boundaries between kinds of writing is simply one kind's ability to pass the fact-checking process, and that there is a universality to which we must sing. These concerns are not unfounded. There is ample evidence of the limitations that arise from the narrow and prescriptive definition of CNF encouraged by the DepEd curriculum guide and by other materials used by secondary level educators. At the high school level, CNF is usually defined as fact-based prose rendered using the elements and techniques of fiction. This is evident in the forms of CNF listed in the DepEd curriculum guide and in the elements attributed to CNF under the same guide. No doubt there's practical value in this kind of definition, which so clearly lays down a roadmap for students to follow. Stick to what really happened and write in terms of fictional elements like character, setting, and plot. Consider this CNF document by the Zamboanga Sibugay DepEd office, which borrows heavily from the terminology in the DepEd guide and unambiguously and exclusively equates CNF with literary journalism. So in my experience, having engaged with instructors who taught CNF under the K-12 program through Likhaan's Himino Abad Seminar Workshop for Teachers in 2023, this is not uncommon in CNF pedagogy. Asked about teaching CNF, these were some selected responses to the question of how would you define CNF? So as you can see here, the union of storytelling and journalism, blending techniques of writing and the authority of the factual, etc. And at the end, unlike fiction, I'm not certain with the elements of CNF. There are clearly gaps in the way that DepEd has delineated CNF in their guides, such that teachers find themselves bound to this kind of definition in practice. A broader examination of other genre practices may offer alternative approaches. For instance, the proposition that all CNFs fall within a spectrum materialize as a distinction between the personal and the implicit public. The United States, whose institutions and authors played a crucial role in establishing CNF as an idea around which we organize a genre, may provide a benchmark. For example, Lee Gutkind, often cited as the godfather and the source of the term creative nonfiction, focuses on two kinds of CNF in his textbook, You Can't Make This Stuff Up: the memoir or the personal essay, and immersion nonfiction. Likewise, the Iowa Young Writers Studio offers creative writing courses for high school students that differentiates the genre into two broad types, nonfiction and personal essay. Both nonfiction in the Iowa Studio and immersion nonfiction in Gutkind's textbook are distinguished from the personal essay by virtue of being a kind of writing about something other than the self. And in our own creative writing program, which allows students to take tracks in particular literary genres, CNF is broken down into two strands, the personal essay and the public essay. An ongoing effort to revise UP's creative writing curriculum has elaborated upon that language, stipulating the distinction as one between writing the self and writing outside the self. So evidently, several tensions have emerged in the usage of CNF in the Philippines: CNF versus essay, literature versus journalism, personal versus public, mere storytelling versus intelligent analysis, criticism, and reflexivity, among others. It is reasonable for any educator to be daunted by these far-reaching issues. However, they can also be utilized pedagogically. The answer to the question of what is CNF shifts from one to narrow definition to an effort to describe characteristics and elaborate upon the emergence and development of the genre in the Philippines. This localized and contextualized approach to understanding the forms of CNF in terms of characteristics corresponding with the broad range of its actual and associated practices, descriptive and adaptable rather than fixed and prescriptive, has proven useful in my own experience. Simply reframing forms and types of CNF as approaches to CNF in the DepEd curriculum, for instance, opens up the variety of pedagogical tools available to the CNF instructor, as the indefinite and changeable scope of the genre can be embraced rather than rendered invisible through a taxonomy that has no strong relation to CNF practices in the Philippines. Now, I'd like to move on to the final part of my lecture, a case for integrating perspective as a key element of CNF in the SHS curriculum. The essential and irreducible fluidity of CNF, its blurry borders, its capacity and its myriad manifestations. I propose to further the variety of texts that fall under the umbrella of CNF. First, the presence of the self, and second, the commitment of the truth to the truth. These are not intended to be definitive, but to provide a craft-based framework for writing in this genre. Singer proposes the I or the voice as one of the few formal conventions that distinguishes creative nonfiction from other kinds of prose. And indeed, the first-person perspective, regardless of whether one is writing a reflection essay or engaging in literary journalism, is paramount in all conceptualizations of CNF as a genre, whether or not the author ever refers to oneself explicitly in the text. The I is understood as the persona, a creation that paints a picture of a character composed of many elements, and those elements can be crafted by the author. The persona, like the self, is tied to identity, which is more than a single individual's personality. It is also about historical, social, and political contexts, although there may be parts of our identities that we can choose and choose how to express. Our identity exists in the complex interplay of our embodiment, our desire, our choice, and our imbrication in situations, according to Adsit and Bird. No doubt, there are high school instructors have recognized and sought to enact an understanding of the self as instrumental to crafting a persona. Consider this exercise included in a module used by the DepEd Cagayan de Oro office, which encourages students to create a timeline of their life, in essence, studying themselves in preparation for writing about themselves. I'd like to add here that, moreover, as mentioned earlier, when I was a panelist for CNF during the Himino Abad workshop for teachers, I very much enjoyed the activities shared by several teachers, which were intended to spur introspection, narrative, and exposition. For example, in the context of Katrina Tuvera's descriptive essay about her family home titled Old House, Gerald Burmas asked students to share how they felt about their own homes using emoticons. And while discussing Resel Mujares' essay about the death of his parent, I Never Sang for My Father, Chris Pimentel asked students to rate their relationships with their father on a scale of 1 to 10. So such exercises are valuable in encouraging students to explore the specific thematic concerns of readings, as well as to help them begin discussing and considering their own experience in preparation for writing about themselves. However, there is a marked lack of the emphasis on a particular materialization of the self that would be crucial in helping high school students engage in reflexivity more deliberately in writing CNF. CNF offers the opportunity for reflexive analysis in understanding the self and crafting the persona. The author's perspective can be concretized as a lens arising from a particular position in the social space, in the understanding that all perceptions, visions, beliefs, expectations, etc., are socially structured and socially conditioned. So what can be challenged in the CNF classroom is the illusion of the absolute point of view, initially condemned to be unaware that it is only a point of view. The omission of the self in the CNF guide is also worth underscoring as a missed opportunity to use CNF to generate learning about media and information literacy, given its emphasis on the need to equip the K-12 graduate with 21st century skills. As well as a policy guideline, the teacher should use interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary approaches, such that, for instance, content in science could also be reading materials in English, and what is taught in science is reinforced by lessons in health, and so on and so forth. In this particular case for CNF, one of the most important steps towards critical media literacy is the ability to recognize the presence of bias and the limitations of an individual perspective, even in texts where the eye is invisible. For many high school students, their first experience of CNF is likely through posting on Facebook or other popular social media sites. Instructors in the CNF classroom may find that students today, their lives governed by social media, have a preoccupation with the self that carries over to the creative writing industry, having honed their ability to write about the self through an endless stream of bite-sized first-person accounts, as Cruz puts it. Online marketing gurus have appropriated McLuhan's popular theory, the medium is the message, to declare that in this oversaturated digital age, the messenger is the message. Even before they think of themselves as writers, students grasp early on that the road to success, and that may be measured through reactions, comments, reposts, shares, or some combination of these, is to commodify the self, to package and disseminate one's experiences and ideas in ways designed to encourage positive interaction, usually in the form of congratulatory and affirmative feedback. In that sense, then, teaching students to take a reflexive view of the self, particularly in relation to the crafting of a persona in their essays, is aligned with application of a critical pedagogical framework, recognizing how the rise of social media and the digital landscape has intensified the persona as spectacle. Critical pedagogy encourages the formation of critical consciousness as a mode of thinking, one that is integrated with reality as opposed to naive consciousness, as Riley puts it, that considers itself superior to facts, in control of facts, and thus free to understand them as pieces. CNF provides students the space to challenge the naive, unexamined, and capitalist notion of self encouraged by the unreflexive use of social media, through examination and application of the more conscious and critical understanding of the self and formation of the persona that is integral to writing an essay. Moreover, among the key tenets of critical pedagogy is the belief that students and teachers should be treated as researchers, both learners and producers of knowledge, with a grounded notion of self and awareness of the knower and the known that stimulates a new level of rigor in knowledge production as well as the interpretation of existing knowledge. This conception is congruent with the push to be more critical and demanding of the self as both subject and producer of CNF. The notion of CNF as a site for the articulation of truth is a popular one. Often in my own classes, students discussing CNF eventually gravitate towards discussions of truth, usually in relation to such concepts as authenticity, social responsibility, and the interest between actuality and memory. Philip Jarrett contextualizes the astonishing renaissance of nonfiction in the United States with the increasing politicization of truth as seen in the rise of alternative facts. He quotes Howarth in describing CNF as a response to crisis, a form that flourishes in time of great upheaval, and states that the role of the fact-based writer is more crucial than ever. Framing the writing process of CNF as one that includes the pursuit of fact may help learners understand truth in relation to accuracy by foregrounding the agency of the writer in conducting both the journalistic and the critical or theoretical modes of research associated with different forms of CNF. When it comes to truths about personal experiences, the genre has been often and legitimately criticized for its perceived myopia. In an often quoted 1997 editorial for Vanity Fair, Walcott caustically called CNF as exhibitionism with an agenda, criticizing creative writing programs for merging creative writing and nonfiction into a big, earnest blob of me-first sensibility that treats writing not as a voyage out but a foraging in. Likewise, on the so-called public or journalistic end of the spectrum, CNF has problems of its own. It is plagued by the same concerns that hound journalism, truth as something that is merely equated with fact, claims to objectivity that deny the inevitability of bias, and prioritization of accuracy over ethical considerations in conducting legwork. The discourse on CNF offers the opportunity to go beyond equating truth with either empirical fact or an unchallengeable subjectivity, and to consider truth in the hermeneutical sense in relation to the need to make sense of the complexity of reality. Reflexivity, in light of these criticisms, must be asserted not as a fixation with the self, but indeed as a resistance to a sensibility that treats the persona in CNF as immune to criticism and interrogation. Moreover, as stressed by Wallach in an article on the importance of teaching CNF in high school, we need more occasions to tell the truth nowadays, both in school and outside it, and CNF is uniquely suited to lead a writer to pose hard questions, do research, and move beyond what makes them comfortable or safe intellectually or otherwise. Wallach further notes the potential of CNF in the formation of high school students who are well prepared for higher education, media savvy, and ready to take up and circulate some of the most difficult debates of our time. In relation to that old maxim, to either write what you know or to know what you write, it would seem that writing what you know is for the personal and knowing what you write is for the public essay. Such dichotomies, though pedagogically appealing for their symmetry and clarity, must be dispensed with. After all, the methods often associated with literary journalism can also be used in writing that is predominantly concerned with the self or with the personal. On the other hand, reflexivity in the interrelated and implicit notion of positionality, which is seemingly the domain of the self as subject, is also crucial to writing about topics beyond the self. Positionality, a critical approach to who you are and where you speak from, rests upon the acknowledgement of power relations in society, according to Adsit and Beard. This aspect tends to be invisible in many journalistic forms of CNF, despite its significance in order to enact principles of transparency and accountability. Perspective, then, is an element of the genre that requires the writer to locate themselves in relation to the subject, to acknowledge their limitations and biases, and to willingly engage in the labor of learning more about the things they do not know. Perspective can be concretized in the SHS classroom in a variety of ways, by asking students to situate themselves explicitly in relation to the subject of their work, by encouraging students to contextualize personal writing, and by teaching tools for research and analysis in order to enable students to address some of the limitations conferred by the implicit partiality of their perspective. In terms of creativity, perspective is something that can be generative at various points of the writing process, from topic generation and drafting to the workshop and subsequent revision. It can also be invaluable in enabling students to engage in reflexive creative practice guided by an approach to craft intended to contribute to the strengthening of competencies in critical thinking. In conclusion, certainly perspective and its related terms, point of view, voice, vantage point, among others, are commonly found in materials on teaching and writing CNF, and yet its absence in the DepEd curriculum guide is a clear indication that the term can be more strongly integrated, not just as one among many topics for discussion, but as a central or foundational element of the genre. CNF offers the potential to challenge rather than reproduce dominant frameworks of understanding. So much of the information that we receive and then transmute into our own creative works is sanitized, processed, packaged to become easily consumable, designed not to threaten any power dynamic or socioeconomic structure. Young writers in the classroom under the current DepEd framework are taught to absorb and recreate specific forms and techniques instead of learning how to engage in the labor of knowing, the sharpening of perspective that is essential in writing. To cultivate a more robust and relevant CNF pedagogy, the curriculum must encourage deeper engagement with the complexities of the self and the challenges latent in making sense and telling the truth about themselves and the world that they inhabit. So I think that's all. Here are my sources. Thank you for listening.